A billion-dollar contract wouldn't get me back on stage, but playing with my son would. After 50 years touring all the stages of the world alone and with my band Genesis, the only thing that could make me change my mind was the option of getting a little closer to my children, whom I had lost due to my failures. It was my moment of redemption.
Welcome to Tremble Podcast, the place for music stories that thrill.
Hi, my name is Philip David Charles Colins. I was born in London on January 30th, 1951. My mother, June, worked in a toy store, and my father, Gref Collins, in the London Insurance Company, just like my grandfather had done before him, and just like he wanted me to do, although, as you know, I would not follow the family lineage. I also had two siblings, Carol and Clive. While my parents were working, I spent a lot of time with my grandmother, whom I adored. I have many memories of my childhood. Perhaps one of the clearest is when my father bought our first car, an Austin 1100 Countryman. On one of the first rides, my father decided to test the brakes. He squeezed them so hard that I flew off and hit the front of the car. You won't believe it, but I still have 2 scars on the sides of my mouth as a souvenir. When I was 3 years old, I was given my first plastic drum. I spent the day giving it a hard time, so some neighbors helped me set up a kind of drum kit with a cymbal and some homemade things. While my family was watching TV, I was in a corner of the living room playing to the tunes of the programs they were listening to. I had my first girlfriend at the age of 10. Her name was Linda. I took her to the fair, and when I got off the Ferris wheel, the school bully gave me a good beating. I guess he liked Linda. From those, I learned that I had to be tougher, and in the following years, I would be the one to protect our neighborhood park using my fists more than once. You know, my family loved the river, and we spent a lot of time there, rented a boat and paddled. When it was proposed to build a club, we were the first to support the idea. In the following years, we had a great time performing and singing in that club. When I turned 12 between my mother and I, we bought my first battery for 50 pounds. It was a 4-piece Stratford kit. I played and played ad nauseum, imitating Ringo Starr and Rolling Stones drummer Charlie Watts. I also liked acting. So at the age of 13, I started taking diction lessons. My parents transferred me to the Barbara Speake Theater School, which would allow me to have my first role in Dickens' play Oliver. I liked acting. But the best thing about school was the ratio of men and women, 9 girls for each of us. You can't imagine how happy I went to class. There, I met the girls I would date intermittently over the next few decades, Lavinia Lang and Andrea Bertarelli. I also met the bandmates with whom I put together my first band, The Real Thing. At 14, I was already playing decent drums, so I thought it would be good to learn to read music, so I asked my great-aunt to teach me how to play the piano. My good ear made me replicate the melodies without having to read the score. So in the end, I never really learned music. In a way, I think that has also given me a lot of creative freedom outside the strict rules of music. In 1966, I was 15 years old. I met a friend who I still have 50 years later, Ronnie Carroll. He was just as crazy as I was about music, but in his case, about the guitar. For a while, we put together a trio with a bass player he knew, but we soon gave up. The following year, I finished my studies. I was supposed to be an actor, but the only thing I got was an extra role in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and another about a cow, which I better not tell you. I wanted to dedicate myself to music, and so I let my parents know. My mother supported me, but my father stopped talking to me for a while. I started working as a professional drummer in different bands, each one worse than the last, but that allowed me to gradually cut my teeth on stage. It would be in 1968, at almost 18 years old, that I dared to compose my first song. The theme was about love, or rather heartbreak. I told how my girlfriend Lavinia had broken my heart when she left me. The song was called Lying, Crying, Dying, and it was the first time I also sang. I recorded a demo with my band at the time, Freehold, but it didn't go any further.
And it's something that I just can't hide. Why did you leave me lying there?
One day, after a performance, I met Ken Howard and Alan Blakely, who had the idea of making an album called Arc 2 about a possible escape of humanity from Earth. After an audition, they took me and my friend Ronnie, and we formed a band called Flaming Youth. When the album was released in 1969, to my surprise, because I thought we had done something pretty bad, it worked well. It even sold out in Holland, which gave me the opportunity to travel for the first time to perform there. Things also fell under their own weight, and the band did not move forward. I was tired of auditioning for other bands and always ending up being the best musician, so I decided to be more selective. It was 1970. I was at my parents' house out of work when I was called to play on a recording at Abbey Road. I was excited. That feeling only increased when I found out it was to be on George Harrison's first solo album. Ringo Starr and Phil Spector, the famous producer, were also there. I played drums until my hands bled, but in the end, they didn't include me on the album. It was a big blow for me, so much so that 30 years later, as a friend of George Harrison, I told him about it, and logically, he did not remember.
Silly, ain't he?
While I was still looking for a band to play real music with, every week I bought all the music magazines and looked at the ads, until one day, I saw one that was squared, so it caught my attention. They were looking for a drummer for a band called Genesis. I called and went to the audition at a house in the country. There were Peter Gabriel, the singer, Mike Rutherford, the guitarist, and Tony Banks, the keyboardist. The audition went well, and a few minutes later, I was already part of Genesis. I was paid £10 a week, double what I had made to date, which I was very happy about. For the first time, I was in a group that had already released an album and had a record deal. Although they hadn't sold more than 1,000 copies of their first album, From Genesis to Revelation, I didn't care about it because I saw a lot of future in the band. Not only could I contribute musically, but also to the good harmony of the group. I was always ready to crack a joke when there was an argument to relax the atmosphere. I moved to live with Mike, the guitarist of Genesis. I loved the eggs that his mother prepared in the mornings. We also rented a van with which we started to travel around the United Kingdom doing small concerts for about 200 people. Despite being tough, I loved the life of a musician on the road. At that time, there were 4 of us, and we still needed one more guitarist. Luckily, life put Steve Hackett on our path. He was not only good on the guitar, but he had brilliant musical ideas. With him, we completed the classic lineup of Genesis. After another tour with a larger audience, between 500 and 2,000 people, and visiting Belgium, it was time to record my first album with Genesis, which would already be their third. Its name, Nursery Crime. It was 1971, and at the age of 20, my career was really beginning. During the recording, it naturally came up that I would sing parts of a song such as For Absent Friends.
It's been to prayer for friends not there.
Since then, I would sing all the second voices of Genesis from my comfortable bench behind the drums. Surprisingly, the album reached number 4 in Italy, so we went there on tour. Our relationship with Italy has always been one of love and lasting over time. In fact, 30 years later, in 2007, we would sing for about 500,000 people at the Circus Maximus. Amazing! But don't think that led us to stardom. In the UK, we were still very much a minority, and we kept going from one place to another in our rented van. In 1972, we would release a new album, Foxtrot, with a 23-minute track, Supper's Ready.
Walking across the sitting room, I turn the television on. Sitting beside you, I look into your eyes.
As a whole, it is wonderful and an innovation for the time. Together with Tubular Bells, it was the longest song recorded touching the limits of vinyl and cassettes of the time. The album took us for the first time to play in Ireland, where something strange and magical at the same time would happen. We were playing an instrumental part of our song, The Musical Box. Then Peter Gabriel, our singer, got off the stage. None of us knew what he was doing. When he returned, he was wearing his wife's dress and a wolf's head. We all hallucinated, but that became a habit, and the audience loved it. So he continued with flower masks, a hat in the shape of a triangular box, and more. Melody Maker magazine would immortalize it on its cover, making us go from charging £35 per concert to $350. That same 1972, we did our first 2 concerts in the United States. It was nothing spectacular, but it allowed us to cross the pond for the first time. But my happiness would be cut short at Christmas because, with no one waiting for it, my father passed away. I wonder if he would ever have been proud of his musician son. What I do know is that I discovered something that left me even more shocked. My father had been unfaithful to my mother. I can't boast of ever having been a very good couple, but that left me stunned. 6 days after my father died, I had to continue with the tour. We took the opportunity to release a live album from that one, since it was clearly one of our strengths. It was called Genesis Live, and right after that, we started recording the next album, Selling England by the Pound, which we would release in 1973 with the remarkable The Cinema Show.
Make my bed, she said, then turned to go. Can she be ready for a cinema show. Cinema show.
Would become our first hit, being invited to participate in the Top of the Pops, the most important musical television program in the United Kingdom. Although we politely declined it because it was not our style, we were not mainstream. The truth is that we would have had the money very good, because we soon discovered that our road manager had generated a debt of £150,000, which would be $2 million today. The tour of the album, which took us through the United States and Canada, ended with 5 mythical concerts at the Royal Theatre in London. Peter wore a silver suit, white face, a cape, and a fluorescent hatbox. It is still remembered. In 1974, and after 18 months of touring, we started working on what would be our last album altogether. We wanted to make a concept album that would tell a story like a book. Peter insisted on writing all the lyrics, while we composed the music. At times it was very difficult, because Peter's wife was also pregnant and having complications. To make matters worse, he was even offered to write the script for a science fiction film, something Peter Gabriel wanted very much to do. We told him that if he did, he would have to leave the group, because he would lose focus on Genesis. The film was cancelled and Peter stayed with us, but something had already broken. We finally had a double album ready with 23 songs that told the surreal and allegorical story of Real, a Puerto Rican boy who lives in New York. Its title, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, with certain parts dubious and others legendary. We prepared a spectacular tour to present it, with 104 dates. As you can imagine, on such a long tour, everything happened to us, from speakers that exploded at a concert in Scandinavia to a giant inflatable penis that appeared on stage in Chicago. When the tour was passing through Vancouver, I saw one of my childhood sweethearts, a beautiful and very sexy girl named Andrea Bertarelli. She just had a son, but the father didn't want to take care of him. I spent a few days with her and her family, whom I have always adored, and we reconnected. So much so that I left Canada with a girlfriend and a daughter, Jolie Mary Bertarelli. Musically, we noticed how Peter's figure grew and grew, and the rest of us were left behind. On his part, he had become the center of attention, and it was increasingly clear to him that he would seek his way out of Genesis. In fact, he let me know before the end of the tour. I don't have any grudge against him. We were and are friends. I even still remember his last words as the singer of Genesis. "It's just rock and roll, but I like it." The rest of the members of Genesis, Tom, Mike, Steve, and I, Phil Colins, were ready to continue, but we needed a singer. We ran an ad that more than 400 candidates applied for, but none of them fit us. In the meantime, we started writing a new album. At that time, our guitarist, Steve Hackett, who hadn't been much involved in writing the lyrics, wanted to start doing it. But in Genesis, the inertia was that the lyrics were mostly written by Mike and Tony, so Steve decided to release a solo album. We thought it was perfect, and we helped him. I did something similar. I was offered to join as a part-time drummer in a funk and jazz group called Brand X, which over the years would release several albums, including Unorthodox Behavior in 1976 and Moroccan Roll in 1977. It was 1975 and we had to record the album, as there was no other option. I proposed to the group to record it myself as a singer and continue looking for an official singer. So we did, but the surprising thing for everyone, including myself, is that it worked very well. I felt much more comfortable than I imagined, and the album sounded great, so with some fear I left the drums behind and became the frontman and singer of Genesis, releasing in 1976 A Trick of the Tail, which reached number 3 in the UK charts, equaling our previous record with Peter Gabriel. Yahoo! We were happy, and little by little I learned the craft of being a singer. I still remember that in the first concert I didn't know what to wear, what to say before the songs. I didn't even separate myself from the microphone singing, and I was almost all the time with my hands in my pockets. But But over time, I started to feel more and more comfortable. I would get dressed in a white jumpsuit and jacket, which made me feel good, and I would start to take the microphone off the mast and move around the stage. I was light years away from Peter, but we incorporated lights, effects, and more elements that made our concerts an experience. In fact, one day I came up with the crazy idea of hitting my head with a tambourine and dancing at the same time to the song, I Know What I Like. You won't believe it, but that dance would become my hallmark from then on. Almost as soon as the tour ended, we went to Holland to record our 8th album, Wind and Wuthering, and meanwhile, my wife Andrea Bertarelli would carry my first blood child, Simon Philip Nando Colins, who would be born in 1976. For the band members at that time, Genesis came first, and for me too. Our commitment was total, so I could only spend a few days at home with my son and continued with the tour. That would logically end up affecting my relationship, and sometime later we separated, Andy going to live with my children in Canada. By the way, you may be wondering, if I was the new singer of Genesis, who was the drummer? Initially, we had a friend and great drummer named Bill Bruford, but he left us soon, being replaced by Chester Thompson, who would stay permanently. The Wind and Wuthering tour in 1977 began to take us to bigger venues, such as Madison Square Garden in New York or our largest concert to date, in Brazil for 150,000 people. We even had a personal bodyguard each to prevent us from being kidnapped. What an experience! But not everything was going well. Our guitarist Steve got tired of not being able to contribute more in the composition and finally decided to find his way out of Genesis. There were only 3 original members left, but that didn't stop us. The 3 of us started composing, and by the end of the year we had And Then There Were 3, which would be our most successful album up to that point. Yahoo! It was already 1979. Mike and Tony, my colleagues from Genesis, were setting up personal solo projects. So I took the opportunity to reconnect with my great friend Peter Gabriel, playing on some of the songs on his 3rd album. Another curious friendship I forged that year was with Eric Clapton, for whom I would produce several albums over the next few years. At that time, self-production was beginning to be carried out. Musicians set up small teams at home to compose, and I decided to do the same. I had never seriously started writing and composing, but little by little I got the hang of it, and I created things that sounded good, like a song called In the Air Tonight, which, contrary to what many think, is very spontaneous. It doesn't have a premeditated meaning. It came out that way. In case I have a fund, it is that I am going to move on with my life after the separation from Andy.
But I can feel it coming in the air tonight. Oh Lord. Well, I've been waiting for this moment for all my life. Oh Lord. Well, I can feel it in the air tonight. Oh Lord. Oh Lord.
I still had no idea that I could create an album of my own, so I got together with Tom and Mike, and we wrote Duke, the 7th Genesis album. All that until one day when I was with Amit Ertegun, the head of Atlantic Records in America. I played him my demos, and he instantly said, "This has to be a record." As it was something very personal and introspective, I decided to call it Face Value, seeing the light of day in 1981. I didn't have high expectations about him. In fact, I was still with Genesis preparing the tour, while I was receiving more and more news of the good performance of the album, especially In the Air Tonight, which became #1 in Germany, and after my performance at Top of the Pops, #2 in the UK, something that Genesis had never achieved. Suddenly, I had 2 careers in parallel, Genesis and Phil Collins. Marriages, children, alcohol, and above all, a brilliant solo career await in the second part of the story of Phil Collins and Genesis. Don't miss it.
Thank you for joining us until the end. If you like the video, please subscribe and share it with everyone.
Thank you very much, Trembles. We love you.